To this second session of the Responsible AI Forum preview. So my name is Matthias and I'm heading the Junior Research Group Ethics of Digitization at the Tomb School of Governance. And I'm also principal investigator of IEAI's offline spillovers, potential real-world implications of online manipulation, and the ethics and practice of AI localism at a time of COVID-19 and beyond research projects. You've heard about the second one already in this first session. It is a great pleasure to moderate session 2 of this 2-day virtual event, which is a teaser for the Responsible AI Forum that will take place from the 7th to 9th June 2021 in Munich. So you can learn more about the Responsible AI Forum on www.responsibleaiforum.com, and you can actively participate by submitting your idea.
Hello, everyone. I'm going to jump in because I think Matthias has maybe lost his connection for the moment. I'm Caitlin Corrigan, the Managing Director of the IEAI, and I will continue just to introduce the panel, and hopefully Matthias can come back and help us moderate it. So as Professor Lüdke mentioned in session 1, the heart of the IEAI is its projects. During this session, you have the opportunity to hear how the IEAI is playing its part through research directly from the people who are involved in 4 of our research projects that run under the umbrella of our research profile. The topic of this session is AI ethics and online behavior. And together with our 4 distinguished members of the panel, Anna Baumert, Irina Dolgopolova, Jens Grossklags, and Jürgen Pfeffer, we will share our views, thoughts, and expertise on this very important topic, and also some of the findings of their research. As with all the IEAI projects, these 4 research projects, which they will present shortly, involve faculty members from distinct disciplines working closely together towards the development of operational and ethical frameworks in the field of AI. The IEAI's inter, multi, and transdisciplinary research approach promotes active collaboration between technical, engineering, and social science. And this enables us as researchers to comprehensively address a growing group of ethical challenges arising at the interface of technology and human values, and also develop operational frameworks, ethical frameworks in the field of AI. Through our research, we're trying to give answers to questions such as, how can we use AI to understand, predict potential harmful online trends? What is the role of AI in shaping online and offline social behavior? How can we manage this role in an ethical way? And how might AI-driven marketing challenges challenge consumer choice, autonomy, or behavior? And finally, what are the ethical and privacy-related implications of AI-influenced decision-making? Before we start, I would like to introduce our panel members. We have Anna Baumert, who is a professor of personality and social psychology at the Tomb School of Education, head of the Moral Courage Research Group at the Max Planck Institute on Research on Collective Goods, and the principal investigator of our personalized AI-based interventions against online norm violations. Irina Dolgopolova is a researcher for the Tomb School of Management, and her research interests include, among others, consumer perception and willingness to pay for healthy foods, and behavioral perspectives on consumer choice, with a focus on nudging. She's also a member of the project team for consumer perception and the acceptance of AI-enabled recommender systems. Jens Grossklags is an associate professor for cyber trust and directs the chair of cyber trust at the TUM Department of Informatics. He's also the principal investigator of the Personalized AI-Based Interventions Against Online Norm Violations project, along with Anna Baumert. And finally, we'll have Professor Dr. Jürgen Pfeffer, who is an associate professor of computational social science at the big data at the Tomb School of Public Policy and Research, and sits at the intersection of social and computer science. Professor Pfeffer is principal investigator on both our online Firestorms and resentment propagation on social media project, and along with Matthias, our online offline spillovers research project. Once again, we will take questions through the Q&A function after all the panelists have had a chance to present on their projects. So with that, I will give the floor first to Professor Baumert and Professor Grossklags for their presentation.
Thank you very much, Caitlin. Hello, everyone. I will first share my screen so that you can see our slides. So it's a great pleasure to have the opportunity to present a bit of our joint research project of Jens Grossklags and mine on personalized AI-based intervention against norm violations. And we're looking forward to discussing our preliminary findings. Sorry. Okay. So from the vast array of potential norm violations that can happen in the online space, we decided that we want to focus on online hate speech and online harassment. So that means abusive language or offensive language that happens in the online space. And while in case of harassment or trolling, it can be directed against individuals. In the case of hate speech, the abusive language is targeted against particular social groups or individuals that are identified as members of particular social groups. And hate speech has detrimental consequences, both for the individual, but also on a broader societal level. For the individual victim of hate speech, it can trigger feelings of anxiety and otherwise have detrimental impact on mental health. But on a broader societal level, hate speech diminishes and excludes members of particular social groups from the societal discourse. And that means discourse can shift both in content and also in the social norms that it communicates. And unfortunately, at present at least, hate speech is quite a widespread phenomenon in online contexts. And we know that there are particular personality characteristics that predispose certain people to engage in abusive language and hate speech in particular. But we also know that beyond personality characteristics, there are also situational or contextual characteristics that enable or provoke or facilitate hate speech to occur. And that means that in principle, online users that don't usually engage in abusive language or hate speech in particular can come to commit these kinds of transgressions in certain contexts. And that's really where our project wants to pick up on. So we asked, how can we intervene against transgression? Intervene against transgressions in ways that make hate speech less likely to occur and facilitate other online users to speak up against hate speech. And our project has three aspects: technical aspect, a psychological aspect, and an ethical aspect. And Jens will develop on the technical side.
That's right. Thank you, Anna. So what we want to do in the following is to give some overview about some interesting developments in each of these three areas and to also trigger some discussion questions. And in the middle part, we will talk about first results of a study that we have conducted in the previous months. So in the informatics part, I want to give you a bit of an overview about what is happening in the space leading up to the vision of our project on AI-based personalized interventions. So here, for example, we make the observation that in order to moderate hate speech online, oops, isn't one too far. In order to moderate hate speech online, we have to actually account for various kind of trends in reality. That is that it is a very pervasive threat to our online systems, overwhelming the current army of moderators, so to speak. So we do need a certain amount of automation when it comes to dealing with hate speech. However, one also has to take into consideration that the most common approaches in terms of moderation at the moment are focused predominantly on the deletion of context. And that, of course, raises a number of problematic issues, in particular with respect to free speech online. So these kind of reactive approaches are not necessarily what we have in mind. So a first part of our project then is to actually review the space of available technologies, available approaches, and so on. And what you see on this slide is somewhat of a summary of the various kind of dimensions of technologies and generally approaches in the moderation space that we have observed. So for example, of course, there are differences in terms of the scale of these approaches, right? Ranging from very small to very large kind of industry farm moderator approaches. However, we also observe that moderators have different roles. So focused, for example, on explicitly disallowing certain forms of content versus in other scenarios, it is more about shaping the community in which moderation takes place. And finally, which is the focus of our project, it's also about managing technology that may foster the development of unwanted comments online, but also counters it in the form of moderation technologies. And this view on the different tools is also something that we are very interested in, ranging from fully automated approaches to manual approaches and this hybrid world in between. So trying to move on to the next slides. Several questions can essentially be raised. First is, how can we actually improve, for example, the effectiveness of these different tools that we have already available in the marketplace, whether these are approaches that are mostly driven by humans or actually these fully automated approaches. And of course, both visions, the manual approach and the fully automated approach, require different ways of conducting research to further improve these mechanisms. When we are specifically looking at tools, we may ask ourselves also the question, not only whether they're effective in dealing with hate speech, for example, but also how they actually change the culture in a web forum and how do they change actually the work of the moderators, whether these are more grassroots efforts or whether these are really institutionalized moderators in practice. So trying to move to the next slide. Yes. So here again, we see a nice schematic showing the different approaches that we observed in the moderation technology space. So as I already indicated, there is a differentiation between reactive, where it's mostly about the removal, the banning, and so on of certain content and users, versus a proactive approach, where it's about caring and preventing comments through in-depth community interactions. Technologies may be driven on a platform level, like we see it on the large social networks, but it may also be a peer-driven approach. And of course, in line with that, we also see that moderation can be organized in a distributed fashion or in a much more centralized hierarchical fashion. So here we again also have to focus in on the capabilities of the different devices. For example, are they able to moderate directly different forms of content? For example, voice, video, text, which may be of relevance, for example, in the context of online gaming, where you have different kind of interaction channels at the same time that are moving forward at very high speed. So moving on to the next slide. Some of the issues that I've already mentioned is this multiplicity of many different approaches and systems, which are really a focus of this status quo review effort that we are undertaking. For example, we're taking a closer look at the various algorithmic moderation technologies that are out there, starting, for example, with the Automod, which is a popular tool on Reddit, to modes and tools that are becoming fully automated and also using various forms of machine learning technology. Of relevance to our behavioral experiment is also the notion of grassroots efforts. So what kind of tools can, for example, individuals use on platforms if they want to, for example, engage in counter speech, a concept that Anna will talk more about on the forthcoming slides. Finally, there may be also cooperative moderation technologies such as Squadbox and so on. So with that, I want to also hand over the staff again to Anna to discuss our behavioral experiment.
So as Jens already outlined, a lot of effort has been taken with regard to reactive moderation, and on the behavioral level, we know that reactive moderation in terms of suppression or removal of content does have positive effects in terms of preventing future hate speech. But we want to move on beyond the pure censoring of content and look at the effectiveness, the psychological and behavioral effectiveness of more sophisticated approaches, maybe located in between reactive and proactive moderation. And one kind of grassroots moderation could be counter speech, which is individual online users speaking up and confronting whenever they perceive hate speech. And there is some preliminary evidence out there that counter speech has positive effects on other online users in terms of that it facilitates counter speech by others, and it prevents the occurrence of future hate speech. And what's important for our project in terms of moving towards tailoring interventions to individual online users, there's also some first indication that how effective counter speech is on other online users really depends on how these other online users construe their relationship with the sender of the counter speech. So in particular, whether the other person is perceived, the sender of the counter speech is perceived as a member of the own social group. And that's where our project, our empirical study started from. So we were interested in perceptions and behavioral reactions to somebody else's counter speech. And in our study, we presented students from TUM with online chat scenarios, and these scenarios were about a competition between TUM and LMU. You might know another university in Munich. And in this chat, one person makes a homophobic slur, and then another person speaks up against the slur. And we wanted to know from our participants how they perceived that intervener, that person making the counter speech, and whether they wanted to support the counter speech behaviorally in terms of leaving a like for the comment or comment themselves against the transgression. And really the key finding in our study is that how much people supported the counter speech, both in terms of attitudes and in terms of behavior, dependent on whether they perceive the counter speech as coming from their own group. So we asked people, how typical do you perceive this behavior, so the counter speech, for your own group? And how desired do you see this behavior to be within your own group? And the more people endorsed these questions, so the more they perceive the counter speech as normative for their own group, the more they supported the counter speech. And interestingly, or strikingly, really, this was the strongest predictor of support for counter speech beyond attitudes related to the issue, so LGBT attitudes or political orientation. And this finding, this correlational finding, really points to the possibility that if we're able to kind of tailor the sender of counter speech in such a way that he or she is perceived as coming from the own group or being normative for the own group, then we can expect counter speech to be more effective. And we already tried to address this in our experimental part of the study. We had several groups of participants, and one group, the counter speech came from a student from their own university, that was TUM, and for another group from the other university, LMU. But in this case, in our study, we didn't find an effect of this manipulation. So, and we believe that this might be the case because the students of TUM share a social group membership with the students from LMU, namely that they are students. So potentially in this situation, the TUM versus LMU contrast wasn't really the relevant one. And we want to pick up on that in future studies and try to really tailor the group membership of the Center of Counter-Speech more closely to the social identity that is most relevant to an online user in that particular context. And of course, moving forward with this idea of presenting counter-speech in different ways to different online users, we would also want to rely on bots delivering the counter-speech. And that's why in this study, we also compared the effectiveness of counter-speech coming from a human and from a bot. And we did not find a difference here. So it seems that at least in this setup, also counter-speech coming from a bot could be perceived as coming from one's own group and then having a positive impact on one's support for the counter-speech. But of course, presenting different centers of counter-speech to different online users comes with quite some ethical challenges, and we would like to end with those. So Jens, do you want to take that last slide?
Perfect. Thank you for switching to the last slide. So obviously, this is not a comprehensive treatment of the ethical aspects of engaging in counter speech in automated moderation or various kind of similar strategies. However, we want to highlight a couple of issues that may also be suitable for guiding our discussion later on. So the first issue I want to raise is that, of course, the more we engage in group-based interventions or even personalized interventions, the more we have a trade-off between the social good of preventing hateful speech on the one hand, but also certain privacy harms on the other hand. So how much do we have to learn about the people engaging in dialogue, whether hateful or not, on a platform to do this kind of targeting? We know from platforms such as Facebook and other social networks that, of course, such characterization of individuals is already taking place, and it's moving quickly towards really grasping important features of the identity of individuals on this platform, which is, of course, then suitable to engage in strategies as we have seen it in this experiment. However, this is the focus of some of our work to really explore this trade-off between privacy and this intervention personalization. The second issue I want to raise is the one of autonomy and control. So to which degree should actually users on a platform be allowed to manage themselves, whether they should be subjected to these forms of counter speech in practice? Should this be similar to other kind of privacy settings, for example, on a social network, or for the social good, should we disallow actually individuals to avoid being engaged with these kind of automated or human moderated approaches? And the final challenge I want to mention for our discussion is, again, the matter of free speech and similar rights on social platforms. So to which degree, for example, does counter speech and similar interventions actually have an impact on free speech, if at all? So would we even see such strategies where individuals, similar to nudging, still have a choice to further engage in wanted and unwanted speech as something that deeply impacts and restricts free speech? Or is it actually something that is happening in parallel? So with these three challenges, I think we want to close our presentation. We have a last slide to also show our team members that are participating, which are mostly the two funded students, Tina and Niklas, but this topic really engages our broader teams in a very deep way. So there are other PhD students and also postdoctoral students who are really interested in this project. And I suspect this team will be further growing over the next 2 years. So with that, I want to close the presentation. Thank you very much. And we will see each other for the discussion again.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Baumert and Professor Grossklags. And pardon me for my abrupt disappearance during the introduction, but I'm safely back now. And I'd like to quickly hand over to our next speaker, who is Irina Dolgopolova from the TUM School of Management.
Thank you so much, Matthias. Could I share my screen? Can you hear me? Can you see my screen?
Perfect.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Yeah, so we'll start from the beginning. I want to present you our small project where we try to understand consumer perception and acceptance of recommender systems when they employ different types of nudges. So we all know that consumers recently, they navigate a very information-rich environment, basically swimming in the sea of information. And they face an increasing amount of choices online. And of course, recommender systems developed to help consumers, to aid them make choices in these information-rich environments. It can be any choices related to online consumption. But of course, for the recommender systems to function, they need to use a lot of information about consumers. So they can use, for example, previous choices made by consumers, product ratings, or any other consumer characteristics that can be interpreted as indicators of consumer preference. The question is, do recommender systems actually increase consumer well-being? I mean, the idea, of course, is very nice to help consumers, but is it actually in the interest of consumers that recommender systems are helping them? Why can it be good for consumers? Because, of course, the amount of choice and information is overwhelming. And consumers sometimes, and maybe actually quite often, make their decisions without the elaborate decision making. So they use different heuristics and shortcuts to make online consumption choices. And because they do that, they are very prone to the influence of environmental factors. These environmental factors can actually be anything that surrounds the choice of consumer. So basically, any elements of choice architecture that marketers or retailers can be using to arrange the products on the screen or within the recommender system can influence consumer decisions. One of such methods to steer consumer choices in the desired directions is called nudging. Here you can see the definition of what a nudge is, that it's actually a method that alters people's behavior in a predictable way. When we talk about nudges, here are examples of nudges implemented in a recommender system. One example is a so-called default nudge, when from the two choices that consumers see on the screen, one is already chosen for them. So to choose another options, consumers need to switch, and because consumers are very often lazy, they just don't do that and agree with the options, with the option that was pre-chosen. Another example here is from the recipe recommendation website, and it highlights the recipes that are healthier, better for consumer health. So again, trying to attract consumer attention here with this bright sign. So which ethical concerns come to mind when we talk about choice architecture and consumer decision making within the recommender systems? First of all, consumers might react negatively, and they often do, to the use of technology that actually can undermine their autonomy of choice. And consequently, their well-being can be decreased compared to the unaided choices. Another ethical concern is that consumers often feel manipulated by the technology. And this perceived manipulation can also be aggravated when the choice environment is augmented, for example, with nudges, or it can be also any other element of choice architecture. So what we did, we used the mock-up of a nudge integrated recommender system in online food environment to study the following questions. Which factors influence consumer perception of a recommender system? If this perception differs when nudging is involved, and if actually the perceived manipulation and privacy concerns impair the acceptance of recommender systems. What we did, we performed a survey based on technology acceptance model. And here you can see it was quite an extensive survey. We had a screening questionnaire, then some control questions, and after that, consumers proceed to the product choice. They were given to make a choice out of a menu, which was presented like that to consumers. We had 3 groups where consumers were randomly distributed. In the control group, they did not have any nudging elements on the screen. And then we had one treatment with healthy choice nudge and another treatment with popular choice nudge. After that, consumers also received the information in the control group. The information concerned only the recommender systems. And in the treatment groups, they also received information of what a nudge is and how it works in online environments. After that, they completed different scales. We use different scales to measure their understanding of recommender systems, their experience, scales for choice responsibility, privacy, perceived manipulation, ease of choice, effectiveness, and acceptance of a recommender system. So here is just an overview of the socio-demographic characteristics of our sample. It was comparable with the German population. This is the analytical framework that we used to analyze the results. So we used several variables as external predictors. And then we use the measures for perceived effectiveness and perceived ease of choice that should predict the acceptance of a recommender system. So here how the model looks when we actually calculate it with all the variables included. And here are our results. And what is interesting here is that actually, as expected, the perceived effectiveness and perceived ease of choice within the recommender systems, they significantly influence the acceptance of recommender system across all the 3 groups. So this result doesn't change. And the influence of perceived effectiveness of a recommender system is more substantial. Also, we observe the negative influence of perceived manipulation. So perceived manipulation actually decreases the perceived effectiveness of a recommender system. Moreover, interestingly, prior experience with recommender systems, we were expecting that it will be significantly influence the acceptance, but it didn't, and neither were socio-demographic characteristics, so they were all insignificant. Here you can also see this is the measure of the scale that was used to measure perceived manipulation, and you can see that between the 3 groups, so these differently colored columns are the different groups, we do not observe significant differences in perceived manipulation. So basically, adding nudging manipulation to the screen did not increase the perceived manipulation by consumers. Oh, Caitlin is telling me that I should speed up. Okay, then I will finish very quickly. So yeah, we also observed no significant differences in perceived effectiveness and overall recommender system acceptance. So our main conclusion is that actually consumers do not perceive themselves to be manipulated by nudges, which are explicitly presented on the screen, but they do worry about their privacy when using recommender systems without easily observed algorithms. So what consumers actually care about, and I think that corresponds to what have been said in the first session, that tracking users' activity online and engaging in data trading, these are the examples of conducts that cause consumers' privacy concerns. And when it comes to the specific implications of our research, it is necessary that e-commerce platforms should provide transparency on their handling of users' data, that if they use any methods of choice architecture, they should be more specific about the attributes of highlighted products. And of course, there is always exists the trade-off between the effectiveness of the interventions and the non-intrusiveness for consumer choice autonomy. And that would be all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Irina. So I would like to give the floor now to our last speaker, who is Professor Jürgen Pfeffer from the TUM School of Public Policy.
Can you see the slides? Perfect, thanks. So I'm here to present the work or the project of two projects. The one is with Massimo Fornacier, and we are interested in basically the bad things in the internet, you know, like from firestorms to hate speech and all these evil things that are out there. But we are particularly interested in the structure and dynamics of these things. So not so much about where it comes from and how we can prevent it, but more like how can we detect it and how can we model it in order to better understand these dynamics. And the second project is about, with Matthias Uhl together, is about, but what does this mean for real life? Are these negative dynamics that we observe online or possibly manipulations online, can they actually impact real life and real life behavior? And I want to show you some first results of these projects and the way how we see the challenges in this project. So first of all, online firestorms. For those of you who are German natives, you probably know the word shitstorm because this is the German word that is used, and Americans find this word very funny because it means something else in the US. So that's why in the US we all use online firestorms. But it's basically it's this discharge of negative emotions towards a company, a politician, or a celebrity, or more and more even towards regular people who say something wrong, do something stupid, and then thousands or more people online, pretty much hate them very explicitly. And what you can see here at the bottom is, this was from a previous project of mine. This is about how it looks like. You see like people just discussing, in their daily networks, random topics, and suddenly these people focus on one particular issue and all talk about one issue and communicate in all different clusters, communicate suddenly with each other. But the good news, if you are in the eye of a firestorm, you know, after a week or two, it's gone and everybody's back to normal business. So it often does not have long-term implications, but of course, it's quite a mess. And so based on these negative dynamics, we are particularly also interested, of course, in polarization, radicalization, and in hate speech. But those are basic because this is the context of these negative dynamics. I think my my video has just stopped, but as I think the audio is still online, I'll just restart my video here, and then we should be able to continue our. Okay, you guys see my can you see my screen again?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. So the goal of this first project is really to mathematically, you could see that the collaboration is here with Professor Fornacier, and we are really interested in mathematical modeling of these formations and the dynamics in large groups of interacting people online. So we want to understand the driving factors. We want to understand and model. Matthias, because I again cannot see my video, can you tell me when my screen share is gone?
Yes, I can. So we can hear you, and we see the slide that you're talking about.
Okay. So it's about understanding the driving factors that occur maybe on small group level that then have these negative dynamics on global level. And of course, in order to measure and to understand these dynamics, we need to find ways and approaches to detect, to early detect these dynamics, because this is the first step in order to react or possibly mitigate these dynamics online. So here one of the first results. This is a paper that we are in the process of publishing. It's accepted in a quite good social network analysis and social media conference. And what we did here is we looked at these dynamics from a linguistic perspective. So we looked at 80 different online firestorms, and we looked at different linguistic cues of what changes in this process. And the interesting thing here is not so much the positive and negative emotion, because of course we could, everybody of us could guess that the positive and negative emotions are important when it is about detecting hate. But the interesting thing here is a very significant one was a change in these personal pronouns. So people online talk a lot about themselves, of course, because they talk about what they do, what they like, what they hate, and suddenly they talk about somebody else. They use different pronouns, and they use different. So what's here, what you can see here, what is called like net speak, means they use like they use acronyms, they use like LOL, they use all these different things that we do not use in regular conversation, but we are particularly use when we get emotional and when we talk online, and especially in the Twitter context with short texts. And the idea is here to create better detections so that we can predict these moral outrages basically in real time, so that we can see, okay, something is going on here. Yeah, also possibly as an intervention mechanism, of course, as we saw before, talking about moderation. And of course, in order to moderate something, you first need to detect that something is going on. The second project goes in the direction, okay, online firestorms, hate speech, polarization, and all these negative topics. But you know, when you talk about somebody who is not in your field, or when you talk with a journalist, the first question is, but can this manipulate the elections? Can this radicalize people? Can this does this have impact in the real world? And this is exactly, these are the questions that we have in the second project. And to put it to the research question, can online manipulation lead to changes in real world behavior? And what we do is, together with Matthias Uhl, we have here a straightforward experimental setup. We have real people that interact on social media, and we want to set an online manipulation to these people online, and we want to measure whether this can change the behavior of the real world, of the real world person. So basically, before and after the experiment, we measure political stances on certain topic, and then we set a manipulation. And the manipulation in our first example is really just affirmation. So basically, we tell people that what they say is really great, and they should continue doing this. And to show you also here a preliminary result. Don't worry, I'm almost done with my slides. The interesting thing here is that what we can measure is people that that participate in this project, and the project is really to talk with people online that have a different opinion, and everybody who participates kind of polarizes in a way. There's not much time here to discuss all the details, but the interesting thing here is that when we sort those people by the amount of feedback that they got, so basically how often did the person get a like or a retweet on their interaction with different-minded people, we see that those who got more feedback changed their behavior, doubled the amount on our Likert scale than those who did not get feedback in their discussions. And now you can see, okay, this is a good observation, but where's the experimental part? The experimental part is that this top half is exactly the half that we selected before the experiment, and 99% of the positive feedback that they actually got from us and our bots that were manually and automatically trained to like whatever they say. So the crazy thing here is that this is a first result, and we call it preliminary result because it's a small scale study where we wanted to test all the different systems. And then at the start of the biggest study, of course, Corona hit us, and we are now in a kind of a middle situation where we are transforming the whole thing online, and maybe have a smaller part where we actually bring people into the lab, which was originally planned to bring a lot of people into the lab and make these experiments with people in the room. But we need to change this, of course, a little bit in the current situation. But yeah, if we can reproduce this result on a larger scale, I think this would be quite a big deal. So why is this all important? I mean, negative emotions are in the core of human behavior. We do like to talk negatively about other people and all these things, but we do observe, and there is evidence that these AI enhanced algorithms, they create and reinforce new dynamics. And some of the examples that we just showed are representative for what's there going on. And from the perspective of the larger goals of this of all the projects, we're in the middle here of two focus areas. It's of course about responsibility, delegation, and liability in a system where we have diffused responsibilities through human-machine interactions. And the question is, which behavior shapes people's preferences, maybe even beyond the digital sphere, but also the question about values and democracy, because this shaping of people's behavior might feed back into public discourse and might actually have the potential to change political behavior. And that, of course, if we want to summarize all these projects and papers that we're working on with one word, we're talking about accountability here in the broader sense. With this said, thank you for your attention, and I'm happy for any questions or discussion points. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Jürgen. So we do have time for questions, and let's see, we have one question directly from the audience, and I think that's targeted toward Anna and Jens. So that's from Jazeel Edward Gill. So the question is, would you factor in different levels of hate speech depending on the social media platform? So Twitter may be notoriously insightful, whereas a different outcome may be found on Instagram. And would you, for instance, also consider platforms such as LinkedIn?
Thank you very much for this question. That's indeed a very interesting direction to compare the different platforms. In principle, we are interested in effects of counter speech across platforms. So we believe that counter speech could be tailored in ways to be effective and have positive consequences on different platforms. Maybe it's more important on platforms that see more frequent hate speech than other platforms. But the AI side of our project and the idea to tailor and personalize interventions, of course, also depends on the possibilities that the platforms offer. So the genuine idea is that online users could see different content of counter speech and different senders of counter speech. And of course, that's feasible in different ways and to different degrees across the platforms.
If you want to add something, Jens? Or
if we want to comment,
yeah.
You raise some hands or something? Oh, I guess Jens is first.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to just emphasize the last point that Anna raised a little bit more. So indeed, the interaction modalities on different platforms are very different, and in the sense that they can show very different realities to different individuals based on customization and personalization. And with that, of course, then is also changing the set of opportunities that we do have to then go deeper down the rabbit hole of personalization, also when applying counter speech. And that is important from the perspective that this individual does get a particular type of message, but it's also important from the point of view that other people do not see that this person gets a particular message, right? And that opens up a much bigger playground on what can actually be done. The more of what can be seen by the transgressor or by the victim or by the bystanders can be controlled.
So Jürgen, what's your take on that?
I would have just added one comment from our perspective of trying to understand polarization processes. which might be an additional research question for you guys, because I think my hypothesis would be that depending on the level of how polarized and how much hate already is in the system, your intervention probably will lead to different outcomes. So I think I think your ideas are great, are probably very successful in a very early stage to prevent like polarization, to keep things back. But I think in a situation where people are already kind of radicalized in their communication, I think, or at least our experiences and also from similar work, it shows like that every additional input that tries to take sides or do something is just seen as another like spark in a fire. So I think it's possible that there is like ground when after it has passed something, that it might go in the other direction as a feedback. So basically, if you say if you have an intervention on the wording, then you probably automatically have somebody saying ignore that guy, he just wants to be politically correct or something. Like it could be that you have a counter activity right answering your bot. But I think it's a very good idea as an early interventionist mechanism. Does this sound somehow useful?
Anna? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Jürgen. I don't know if there are any other questions, but if we have time, maybe I can mention one more thought that we have discussed quite at length, which is which identities would actually be credible to be targeted or to be emphasized by a sender. So we have deliberately chosen social identities that are really orthogonal to the offense, to the transgression that is committed by the hate speech. And of course, there are some identities, some social groups that really build their social identity on hate against certain outgroups. And there we are probably looking at a completely different psychological setup. So it's really targeting the middle ground on. Our project is really targeting the middle ground on various levels. So maybe also how heated and radicalized a debate is on a specific issue, but also which identities we are targeting.
So I would love to ask a related, maybe a bit erratic question, because like in the project we have with Jürgen, we have a rather technical definition of what polarization means, because we can measure like people's consent to a certain statement, and we can see basically, well, they move to the extreme end of the scale. But how would you really can you elaborate a little bit on how you would operationalize hate? Because very often if you say offensive language, you know, like a lot of things are offensive to many people. So is there a way to, especially if you think about like people like Nadine Strossen, like people from the free speech movement, who say, well, it's very problematic to talk of hate speech too easily, because then we stifle any opinions, and the university, for instance, is not a place where we should try to protect people as much as possible, but where we should confront them with different opinions that they might find offensive. So where's the line that you draw here? That would be interesting.
Thank you. With hate speech, it's really about diminishing and deteriorating comments aimed against social groups, and usually minority groups. So it's not just any kind of aggressive tone or provocative statement, but it's really tailored against social group membership. I think that's a critical point here.
Okay, so we have another question related to that coming in from the audience, and it asks, is what counts as hate speech or spillovers online distinct from what it is in offline contexts? And then again, the question maybe related to what I just said, who should define and control laws concerning online expressions hate speech, given also the fluidity of natural words. So how can one really determine this in an online context? That would be another question from the audience. Anyone wants to comment on that? Jens?
I think that's a very interesting question. Of course, one issue that differentiates the online from the offline context is the vast reach that social networks may have. And this implied harm that comes essentially from this pervasiveness of networks and the comments, of course, has to be taken into consideration when we are also thinking about what hate speech should be essentially countered with various forms of interventions, whether it's counter speech that we have studied in our experiment or other alternative modes reaching up to banning individuals entirely from a particular platform. So I think that is a very important differentiation. Of course, with a wide reach also come jurisdictional issues and internationalization issues, right? So different countries have different views on what it means to engage in hate speech. If you, for example, contrast and compare the American with the German approach with respect to, Nazi propaganda and right-wing propaganda and so on, there are certainly differences that need to be then accounted for on the platform. So I think these are already like two key factors that differentiate the online from the offline space, but it is certainly not a comprehensive listing.
Okay, thanks so much. So also we are running slowly out of time. I would also love to direct the question to Irina as well, because I'm also like very interested in this nudging literature, because you said like you are asking the people and the consumers did not perceive themselves to be manipulated by the recommender systems. So wouldn't you say that this is part of an effective nudge? So if you don't even perceive to be manipulated, so my question would be, do you think that especially in this case one would need more direct measures? So look at how people actually are changing their behavior because of these systems, because you would say like if I think that I'm manipulated, then already the effect is basically gone, because I will start to rebel against the system. Could you say a bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So that was actually an interesting result, because in our experiment we also looked, but we had like very explicit nudges, as you might have seen, right? The green dot with the healthier choice, and the star. So these like explicit and obvious nudges, which are easily observed by consumers, they do not. So then consumers do not feel manipulated. You're right. What will happen if we use more covert nudges? Unfortunately, we don't know. We need another experiment, which would be like quite interesting if we would somehow classify the nudges by the level of their explicitness or by the ability to be observed by consumer, and they see if the perception differs, for example, depending on how observable the nudge is. Yeah. So, but I would agree. I mean, consumers most probably would tend to feel manipulated when they don't know what happens. Yeah. When something is explicit and presented, they feel more or less safe. When something is covered, then they feel more cautious, of course. Yeah.
I mean, the nudge could be explicit, right? You could say, you could say, warning, and not just manipulation. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. It can be explicit, but it also can be very subtle. But that would be interesting to see, to make an experiment.
Okay, so thank you so much. I think we have to move on. I would like to thank all the speakers for the very interesting presentations and the discussion, and all of you for joining us and contributing to this session with your questions, comments, and remarks. And now we proceed immediately to the last session of this first day. So the topic of this last session is opportunities and challenges for responsible AI in Africa. And I give the floor to the moderator of the next panel, Dr. Caitlin Corrigan, who is the scientific coordinator at the Institute for Ethics in Artificial Intelligence.